Hello everyone, my name is Sari Hanafi, the director of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. On behalf of the center and the minor on transitional justice, a minor that I created in 2006 before the Arab Spring. So I'm so glad that now Rima is taking the lead in this program. So and as the trauma is one of the issue very dear to transitional justice. So Rima Rassi, our instructor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies, and myself, we are very honored to host today the first CAMES talk in this academic year with Janja Mikulan. So I leave the floor to Rima to present you, Janja, and okay. So that's it.
Yeah. So hello everyone. Coincidentally, since Sari mentioned the minor, I should let you know that I was Sari's graduate student and also his graduate assistant at the time that he was developing the minor. And prior to that, I had no knowledge of transitional justice, and I was so inspired by Sari's work as well as the field itself that I ultimately ended up doing my master's thesis with Sari as my thesis advisor on transitional justice, which led to it being established as one of my recurrent research interests as well as teaching interests. So that makes me very honored to be your discussant for today's talk today. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Janja Mikulan, who's assistant professor of politics at the School of Advanced Social Studies in Nova Gorica, Slovenia. Janja is a graduate of this school as well. Her primary research work is in the field of radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism, and, importantly for this talk today, collective trauma. She also deals with broader global security issues and the challenges of globalization. In her research, she applies a combination of different research methods, and she emphasizes on the use of case studies and qualitative, i.e. comparative research plans, which is fundamental as well to her talk today. She is project coordinator of projects entitled The EU as a Global Actor in a Fragmented and Traumatized World, which is a Jean Monnet module that is funded by the EU, and a postdoctoral project entitled Trauma Perspective on Vulnerability to Radicalization. Janja's work invites us to think about transitional justice not only as a question of legal frameworks or political settlements, as we see in the cases of Bosnia and Lebanon today, but also as a human process that is shaped by wounds that remain unresolved, that are deeply personal, collective, and intergenerational, through the lens of trauma. In her talk today, Janja compares Bosnia and Herzegovina with Lebanon to show how trauma can shape the paths of quote-unquote post-conflict societies, specifically within violent extremism, and highlighting the difficulty of societal and communal disengagement and reintegration. By situating trauma at the center of her analysis, Janja highlights a crucial dimension for transitional justice and countering violent extremism, that transitional justice mechanisms and responses must not only consider institutions and policies and political reform, but also the lived experiences and unresolved wounds that continue to shape people's choices and possibilities. Janja, the floor is yours. You'll have around 30 minutes more or less, and then we can open the floor for discussion and the Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll move here. Good morning, good afternoon from my side as well, dear colleagues, professors, students, and guests. It's truly a pleasure, always a pleasure actually, to be here at the AUB, at the center. So I would like to thank Professor Hanafi for inviting me again to AUB. And this year we will be, this time actually, because I've been to the AUB several times, we will discuss a subject that I believe is both academically important and, as Rima said, also deeply human. So the relationship between radicalization, violent extremism, and trauma. Today I will speak about the insights from my comparative postdoctoral study of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Lebanon. The study is financed by our Slovenian Research and Innovation Agency. Why Bosnia and Lebanon? On one hand, they're very different contexts, right? Both quite specific, but on the other hand, there are a lot of similarities as well. So they're both countries marked by histories of war, of division, marginalization, and trauma. So what connects them is the way trauma has shaped the life cycles of violent extremists, their involvement, their engagement, as well as disengagement and post-engagement periods. So my central argument is following. In comparison to established radicalization studies that perceive trauma as one of the risks or as a background risk for radicalization, my argument is that trauma is central to understanding why people get involved, why they remain engaged, and why leaving extremism is so difficult. So just to frame the problem in a little bit wider context, I mean, if we just look at the daily news, we can unfortunately see that political violence in many different forms is increasing, and no region and no country is basically immune anymore. So despite the extensive research, radicalization research, terrorism research, certain mechanisms of radicalization remain contested. So most research has so far focused on ideology, on religion, on socioeconomic factors. And these factors definitely matter, but they do not tell the whole story. A young man or a woman does not risk their life in Syria or in Tripoli just because of an abstract doctrine or ideology. Most of them carry wounds, wounds of neglect, of humiliation, of loss and exclusion. So trauma theory tells us that trauma is not only about events as such. So trauma is not an event, it's the meaning that individuals attach to these events, whether a bombing, a loss of a family, or years of marginalization. Trauma disrupts one's sense of safety, of identity and belonging. And it often seeks expressions, sometimes through anger, sometimes through searching for dignity, and as in our case, it can be through aligning with groups, extreme groups, that promise justice. So our research questions and objectives in these research projects were the following. So we wanted to explore how different forms of trauma shape the involvement, engagement, and disengagement. So we were interested in personal, in collective or social, and intergenerational forms of trauma. We wanted to explore similarities and differences between Lebanon and Bosnia, and also at the end of the project offer certain recommendations in terms of practice and policy. So we want to integrate objectives in terms of empirical and theoretical aspects. So we wanted to provide quite a rare comparative analysis between a Balkan post-conflict or pre-conflict nowadays society and a Middle Eastern context. Because if we look at the studies in the field of trauma, they're quite Western oriented. So scholars are exploring the impacts of trauma in radicalization, but in the context of European countries, Australia, United States, Canada, while the rest is under-researched. And in theoretical frames, we want to position trauma not as peripheral, but as central mechanism, as mentioned before. So a little bit about the context of both countries. I assume that most of you are Lebanese, right? So maybe I will put a little bit more attention on Bosnia. So the war of the 1990s ended with the infamous Dayton Peace Agreement, and similar to Taif's agreement, it ended the war, but it brought a lot of challenges with it as well. The Dayton Agreement frozen ethnic divisions into the constitution and therefore embedded trauma into the governance system itself. So Bosnia also, because of that, that was one of the drivers, became one of the Europe's largest per capita contributors of foreign terrorist fighters to Syria and Iraq. These numbers vary, but estimations are that around 250 adults and over 100 children joined Daesh, especially in the years between 2011 and 2016. And in Tripoli, so our focus in Lebanon was Tripoli. Here the decades of state neglect, poverty, and sectarian clashes also created a very fertile ground for Salafi jihadist mobilization. So we also choose these two cases, these two contexts, because they are similar in terms of quite high numbers of Salafi jihadists that were recruited. So young men, we were focusing on Bab el Tebene, were recruited by mostly al-Nusra, some of them also by Daesh, often after traumatic events such as 2013 mosque bombings. But as we will see later on, this collective trauma was seen in combination with personal traumas as well. Maybe just for those unfamiliar with the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I wanted to show you how the country is ethnically divided. So in this dark blue, we can see the autonomous region, also called Federation, that is mainly Muslim. So there are around 50% of Muslim Bosniaks and around 15% of Croats that are Catholics. So this is the light blue, and the dark blue is autonomous regions, a region of Republika Srpska, with a majority of Serbs living here. And there is a very small district, also quite autonomous, with their own institutions on the northeast, called Brčko district. And then Sarajevo is, as you can see, divided between the Federation and Republika Srpska. Okay, so just briefly about the theoretical framework, because usually the empirical part is more interesting. So what we wanted to integrate is the Horgan's, he's one of the leading scholars in terrorism research. He's mostly dealing with the psychology of terrorism. So we adopted his involvement, engagement, disengagement framework that emphasizes radicalization as a very dynamic and non-linear process. Then in terms of trauma theory, we adopted the interpretation of trauma as multidimensional, so personal, collective, intergenerational, and how this mix, how this combination then shapes the cognition, emotion, and identity. And of course, our main focus was on trauma as a mechanism, and throughout the 2 case studies, I will present you how trauma works as identity marker, as meaning-making mechanism, social glue, and also a barrier to disengagement. In terms of methodology, we employed, of course, a comparative qualitative case study design that enabled us in-depth exploration of the processes and mechanism. This is somehow a must if we want to understand the role of trauma, which is best understood, of course, through the contextual and the narrative analysis. Unfortunately, in Bosnia, we only relied on secondary sources. Maybe in the discussion section, I can tell you more about how research unfolded in Bosnia, but in Lebanon, this was somehow upgraded with the 10 in-depth life story interviews with former fighters from Bab el Tabene, and also 3 expert interviews. So with social workers, psychiatrists, and political scientists, all based in Lebanon. So let's begin with the first phase. So the involvement phase, or that initial vulnerabilities that lead individuals to extremism. So as I mentioned before, Bosnia represents a quite unique environment where trauma is deeply embedded in political and social structures. This might sound familiar to Lebanese structures as well, but in case in Bosnia, this is even more rigid, right? So the war of 92, 95 left over 100,000 dead and 2 million of displaced. And Dayton Peace Agreement that ended the war institutionalized the ethnic divisions between Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, creating a system that entrenches ethnic belonging in constitutional arrangements and daily life. So in Bosnia, youth grew amidst polarized memory politics. They are being socialized, all of the 3 groups, into narratives of victimhood. So competing ethnic groups instrumentalize the historical trauma of the war, such as Srebrenica genocide or ethnic cleansing campaigns, to reinforce these exclusive identities and deny the suffering of other groups. So trauma in Bosnia becomes a political resource that is being constantly reactivated through commemorations, through school curricula, and through denial campaigns. And I would stop here for a few seconds at the denial campaigns. I think there are photos.
Yeah.
Yes. Because this is one of the biggest issues and very important if we want to understand the radicalization in Bosniak community. So as you're probably familiar with, the judgments of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and International Court of Justice legally defined Srebrenica, so the systematic killing of at least 1,372 innocent Bosniaks by the police and the army of then self-declared Bosnian Serb entity, Republika Srpska, under the command of Ratko Mladic and also supported by the neighboring Serbia as genocide. However, Srebrenica and its surroundings are still places of denial and glorification of war criminals. So the denial of the Srebrenica genocide is not just some conspiracy theory or some marginal sentiment, but what we can see, especially in the last 2 years, that this is a policy. It's deliberate, it's well-funded policy by Republika Srpska, by Serbia, state policy of Serbia, and my colleagues at the University of Sarajevo describe this policy as the continuation of war by other means. So basically, in this climate, recruiters also in 2011, 12, 13, framed the Syrian war, so joining Daesh, as a continuation of defending Bosniaks. So for many, joining jihad in Syria and Iraq was not a break with the past, but somehow the continuation of inherited trauma. And here on the picture, you can see the leader of Republika Srpska, Dodik, that constantly enhances this narrative of Srebrenica as being a fabricated myth. So in Tripoli, the story is a little bit different. So because we had the opportunity to conduct in-depth interviews, we were also able to explore more personal trauma. So our respondents revealed us their story, their childhood stories that were often began with early adversity. So they spoke with us about the parental neglect, the poverty, the constant exposure to violence. One interview told us, I feel I was kidnapped from my childhood. And also the intergenerational trauma came out as an important dimension, because many of them told us that their parents were telling them the stories of Syrian massacre in 1986 and how this affected their cognition, their emotions, basically constantly living in fear and threats. But the turning point was the 2013 bombings in Tripoli that somehow transformed this private pain into collective duty. So suddenly, young Sunnis, so men from Bab el-Tabene, felt that they were not defending only their family, but also their entire community. Recruitment happened mostly through mosques, to peers, through neighborhood influences. They told us the environment after the mosque bombings was very religiously, politically inciting. And crucially, in Tripoli, involvement was also linked to sectarian honor and masculinity. So they were telling us that to be a man, it was necessary to defend their family and their community with arms. So in both contexts, in this initial phase of radicalization, we could see that trauma fractured individuals, it fractured communities, and it created susceptibility to extreme narratives. In the phase of engagement, yes. In the phase of engagement, so it is a stage where individuals get fully involved in extremist violence. The dynamics were the following. So in Bosnia, fighters who traveled to Syria saw themselves as repairing their identity. So violence was framed as a very honorable defense of the global ummah, and radical milieus, para-jamats, these are informal institutions or illegal praying congregations, certain NGOs, and also diaspora played an important role, provided not only resources to travel to Syria, but also, let's say, emotional rewards in terms of belonging, legitimacy, recognition, and dignity. However, while engagement, on one hand, offered them empowerment, it also produced new wounds, new trauma when individuals encountered the reality in the field. They encountered brutality and exploitation within jihadi groups. In Lebanon, engagement also proved to be both empowering on one hand, but on the other hand, most of our respondents talked about the moral injury. And this is also one of the aspects that still remains quite unexplored in radicalization scholarship. So on one hand, respondents, the former fighters, talked about pride in wearing a vest, in wearing a gun. Some of them said that they were dreaming of having those symbols of their heroes already from the childhood. One said that he was saving money just to buy, for example, the vest. So they described pride in defending their neighborhood and in becoming somebody. One respondent said, I went from someone who just sits at home, does nothing, to somebody who is powerful, who can defend, finally, his family and community. But they also reported deep scars, especially those that fought in Syria, seeing the atrocities unfolding them, seeing innocent children being killed, seeing the destruction of mosques by Daesh, seeing imams being killed in these mosques. So then they realized that Daesh basically betrayed the core Islamic values. This is what they were reporting, and one of them said, ISIS is a disease. Their real religion is violence. So this moral injury, so this psychological harm that comes from betraying your own ethical code was particularly striking. It was also something I was not thinking of before starting this project, because most of the scholarship focuses in terms of consequences of trauma on PTSD, on complex PTSD. But moral injury is different, right? It's about feelings of guilt, of shame, of disillusionment, and of betrayal. So all of them talked about feeling betrayed by the state, betrayed by sheikhs, betrayed by commanders, the leaders in the neighborhood. And they talked about how they got enriched, for example, how they escaped Lebanon while they were imprisoned. Yes, we can. Yes, here I put some pictures. So in both contexts, the recruitment came from, either the sheikhs, like in the case of Lebanon, and here we have the photos of Nusret Imamovic on the left and Bilal Bosnic on the right. They were the most important figures in recruiting Bosnian fighters, and I also posted their picture. We cannot go into details too much here, but it's very important to understand the history of Salafist jihadists in Bosnia, because both of them were former members of Mujahedin in the Bosnian War. So Bosnia became a country that once, during the war, imported fighters, right? Imported Mujahedin, and now became a country that is exporting the fighters. Okay, so yes, this is, I mentioned this, yes.
Okay.
So then comes this final stage of radicalization, disengagement, which was very similar actually in both Bosnia and Lebanon, because disengagement of at least these 10 people who, with whom we talked, with whom we conducted interviews, disengagement occurred mainly through imprisonment, right? So once they were imprisoned, they got disengaged. So here we are really emphasizing on disengagement, because we cannot give very proper assessments if they really got de-radicalized. So in both prisons, so in Bosnia and Lebanon, so in Lebanon most of them were imprisoned in the Rumi prison, and as you know better than me, the prison is infamous for torture. So all of the respondents, they reported on very poor conditions, on torture, on solitary confinement, and abuse. And in Bosnia, they do not report on this kind of conditions. However, the prisons were also not a place of rehabilitation. Prisons there also lack programs of psychosocial support, rehabilitation, etc. So basically, disengagement was another traumatic chapter in the life stories of fighters. And returnees in both contexts after release, they also faced similar experiences. So being stigmatized, being excluded, feeling unsupported economically. Many until this day cannot find employment, especially in Tripoli. In Bosnia, they returned to their remote villages, and they remain somehow excluded from the society. So we also asked them, the respondents in Tripoli, to fill in the questionnaire, international trauma questionnaire, and we have seen that all of them suffer from the symptoms of complex PTSD, so they're struggling with emotional dysregulation. They have issues with establishing safe relationships. They live in constant fear, and they have quite a negative self-image. Okay. So just to conclude or briefly summarize, we see from both contexts, both case studies, that trauma really played a central role in the entire radicalization process. Similarities in both contexts are that trauma narratives provided identity for former fighters. Violence in both cases basically served as a coping mechanism to the traumatic experiences. And we can also see in both cases how disengagement and post-engagement period re-traumatized the individuals. What is different is that in Bosnia, trauma is really institutionalized, right, in the governance in very rigid manner, while in Lebanon, as we said, also institutionalized on one way, but it's still more fluid and reproduced mostly through the sectarian neglect, symbolic violent events like assassinations, like bombings, etc. So what is crucial in terms of theoretical upgrade is that the life cycle models that are actual in the current scholarship need to include trauma as a dynamic force. And last but not least, we also prepared, based on these findings, some suggestions for the interventions on both individual, community, and structural level. Just to conclude, maybe we can touch this more in detail in the discussion if someone would be interested. But just to conclude, it's important to emphasize that violent extremism is far from being just about the politics, about the ideology, but it is about wounded lives. It is about fractured communities that are searching for recognition, for dignity, and healing. And both contexts remind us that trauma is not just individual scar, but it's a very important social and political force. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you. You want to take a seat?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So I have a little bit of time. Sari has told me I have a little bit of time to serve as discussant. So thank you very much, Janja, for your presentation and for your work. I have a couple of points first that I'd like to, that I picked up from your presentation that I'd like to touch base on. Then I want to revisit the core argument, maybe touch on the Lebanon perspective a bit, and then dive into our Q&A session. First of all, I want to note the comparative lens of your work. So bringing in Bosnia and Lebanon into the same analytical frame. I mean, this comparative angle, it helps us actually to understand, as you mentioned, the dynamics of trauma, which are, again, concurrently, I mean, they're universal, but they're also very context-specific, right? So so your work sort of brings these two aspects of trauma together. I also want to emphasize what you just mentioned as trauma as a Western emphasis, and I think that the struggle with or at least one of the major critiques of the field of transitional justice itself, which, centers trauma, obviously, and the need to revisit trauma and also to revisit the past in order to ensure non-reoccurrence, is written and was developed from a Westernized perspective, so from the global North perspective. So even in terms of the applications themselves, whether it's things like truth commissions or whether you brought up the ICTY and the ICJ and the ICC, all of these are inherently, obviously, Western inventions that have certain notionalized understandings of what justice means, of what, quote-unquote, peace means within, a broader, more international lens. But what about specific, case country contexts? And then three, in my positionality as someone who is Lebanese and who teaches transitional justice and who researches transitional justice, I'm just going to use the discussion to to be able to link your presentation to broader debates and questions from a critical transitional justice perspective, centering your main message out of this and one of your main conclusions out of your research, which is the need for a broader trauma-centered approach to understanding these. Again, we say quote-unquote post-conflict because even the terminology itself is used interchangeably within the field and in Bosnia and in Lebanon, right?
Sure.
So first, I think, the central point that you make in terms of placing trauma at the center of the radicalization and disengagement process, and I think that's what's specifically important. You focus on the disengagement process. Transitional justice itself does a lot in terms of focusing on disarming, reintegration, and so on, but a lot of times that process is overlooked, again, due to politics or due to other, more pragmatic issues for the authorities or for the state that is undergoing the transition. So you center trauma rather than treating it as a background variable. So obviously there's this inherent understanding within transitional justice that we need to center trauma. But unfortunately, we know that in terms of application and the practical perspective, the explicit mechanisms themselves often overlook individual trauma, collective trauma, especially so things like truth commissions, trials, institutional reform are great from the sort of macro societal level, and especially if authorities are at the helm of the transition. So your work reminds us that transitional justice also has to grapple with how unprocessed trauma can affect societies, and in the case of your work, as you mentioned, can fuel these cycles of violence and fuel alienation. You looked at the three different levels of how trauma operates, and I think it's very important to note here that these dimensions of trauma, as you mentioned in your presentation right now, there tends to be a focus on, PTSD and sort of things that come from the psychological dimension. These dimensions of trauma are not just psychological, but also social and also very political. And this is what I often, tell my students. Transitions are inherently political. You cannot effectively dissociate transitional justice from politics. They're fundamentally intertwined processes of coming to terms with past abuses, with societal neglect, and establishing the new, quote-unquote, post-conflict order, whatever that order or society might look like, right? So again, any attempt to separate them risks undermining, I think, the legitimacy of the process, and then again, hindering societal healing. And this societal healing can be understood in many different ways. And some themes that I sort of grasped from your presentation, how people relate to the state, how they perceive the state, their relationship with the state. Social cohesion is horizontal and it's vertical. It's people's relationships with the state, and it's also people's relationships with one another. How they relate to sectarian structures and how they identify themselves within a society as a whole, which are these commonalities at the very least that you were bringing in your comparing and contrasting of Bosnia and Lebanon. Allow me to provide on this note some quick reflections on the Lebanese context. I found it very interesting how you framed Bosnia as frozen in memory politics, but then Lebanon rather as fluid and then constantly reproduced. Through, again, and this is a very important focus, I think, state neglect. The question that we often ask ourselves here, for those of you who are from here, is وين الدولة, where's the state, right? But I wonder if this might miss another dimension, which I want to bring up for you and see what you think about. When we say state neglect, we do say state neglect from a functioning perspective, right? So we look at it as citizens, we see there's no water, there's no power, and so on. But on another angle, one of the things that the state has been very hands-on with and very effective at has been in not addressing trauma, so enforcing this framework of collective amnesia in the country, right? So the post-war amnesty law that was instituted in 1991 and the continuous deliberate silencing of anything related to the Lebanese civil war, related to, these fragmented sectarian identities, have institutionalized forgetting as a political strategy and now produces a paradox. So in Lebanon, trauma is repressed at the official level, and it's even been happening recently. So for those of you who remember the Beirut port and the young individual who drew the graffiti, who said, my government did this, and then less than a month later, there's a picture of someone painting over it, and then the kid came back, I assume, someone, youth, a young member, and wrote again, my government did this. So this is even active on a daily basis, beyond just notions of the war. It's become institutionalized. So again, trauma is repressed at the official level, but it constantly resurfaces in people's daily lives through sectarian politics, through violence, and through neglect. So in this case, I think it's interesting that Lebanon offers a case that presents both dynamics, so an official regime of forgetting and a lived reality of recurring trauma. So we might ask ourselves if this enforced amnesia is itself a form of violence. One that ensures the trauma remains unresolved, so that's regardless of sectarian affiliation or group identity or whatever, and one that remains available for mobilization. In this case, it could be available for mobilization from the perspective of recruiters and whatnot, but at the same time, I would say available for mobilization also when the state or politicians see fit, right? And since your fieldwork draws from life history interviews in Tripoli, I just want to take a moment to comment on this. Tripoli, we comment a lot on it as being a neglected periphery, but also, Lebanon is the second largest city in Lebanon. Tripoli, is the second largest city in Lebanon. And recently we had the municipal elections, and I remember turning on the TV, and there's a bunch of these, political analysts were saying, the important struggle for understanding what people want and what society needs and desires is happening within Tripoli, but effectively the presence on the ground and way it's translated later on into politics, into representation is not there. It's a city marked by poverty, that's for sure, repeated cycles of violence. These have all left deep scars on the population from before 2013, so we know that. And more importantly, we know that the social and class disparities in the city are high, regardless of the fact, for those of you who live here, you know that Tripoli has produced some of Lebanon's most prominent and wealthy politicians in the highest of positions. So in Tripoli, we do see this continuation of trauma, the persisting of trauma, but in various forms. That's the way I perceive it. So in abandonment, in the physical absence or the absence of a functional state, which makes trauma here both profoundly personal and collective. So when we talk, I think, about trauma in Tripoli, it presents itself as a space where neglect, where poverty, where the entry of these alternative sort of, as opposed to the official, like you mentioned, Dar al-Fatwa in your presentation, and other maybe more official state representatives, produce and reproduce this alienation. So just to wrap up, I think Two final reflections. I think, yes, the state in Lebanon is absent in terms of functioning governance, that's for sure. We feel it every day. But it is quite active in instituting, strategies, whether, official or unofficial, institutional or not, in instituting, an absence of a desire to, address this trauma, which we know in Lebanon, similarly to Bosnia, is intergenerational. As someone who's been studying transitional justice here for quite some time, sometimes I just look at how people who are, 20, 30 years younger than me converse online, and they're using the same narratives and the same stories that were produced and reproduced by their parents of the Lebanese Civil War. So again, how the state contributes to this generation of trauma, the legacies of war, and how trauma is an ongoing lived condition, I think, in both contexts. In this case, I think thinking about transitional justice in both contexts needs to go beyond, not just focusing on the past, but seeing how we can think about trauma. And I think this is something that, is problematic in the literature. Trauma is not thought of as continuous or as a continuous process. There's a time element to it. This started, this ended, and this is when people become traumatized, as opposed to seeing it not as much as this linear, direct progression, but rather something that is dynamic, that can come, that can go, that can, as you mentioned, be brought back by certain trigger events and so on. And then two, I think in both contexts, the role of sectarianism in the reproduction of trauma. So unlike what I see as Bosnia's, very rigid, as you showed from the map, institutionalization of the ethnic identity under Dayton, Lebanon's sectarian system functions, as you mentioned, on this idea of fluidity. So within fluidity is competition, sectarian competition within this clientelist system. But the result is similar. So while there's differences in Dayton and Ta'if, the result is similar, this production. And now here we're sort of talking also on a societal scale, so not just these specific groups of people who end up choosing the path of radicalization. But then rather, it produces, generally speaking, vulnerability, mistrust, feelings of competition between one another, feelings of marginalization, alienation, and abandonment. So here, trauma is constantly reproduced by sectarian politics on a daily basis, rather than healed. So in closing, I just want to reflect again, how your work reframes radicalization again, and I think this is very important, not as an ideological or a security question. I think we've all become accustomed to understanding these as a predominantly security issue. A lot of our issues in Lebanon and also in Bosnia, whether it's refugees or whether it's are framed more as security as opposed to, any other sort of understanding. But here you have it rooted in trauma and these unresolved wounds. And we know all too well, I think, in Lebanon, and now it's nice that we got to know through Bosnia, the Bosnian case, how unprocessed trauma continues to shape, our politics, our political divisions, our sectarian attitudes, and our communities to this date. And I think that your work, to end here, it challenges us both as scholars and practitioners, specifically in transitional justice, to think of this field, again, beyond the practical perspective, as this long road of unfinished work. Maybe there is no time frame to cut off and say society is healed, but rather address trauma and raise that, again, might be the ultimate pathway to ensure that this trauma is not reproduced, nor does it produce new forms of violence in the future. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Rima.
So what we're going to do is, I guess, if you want to bring up any comments or you'd like to comment on the discussion, I'll give you the floor first, and then we'll open the floor if you have any questions for our speaker.
You open, you collect, you see.
Let's go ahead with that.
You try to,
Yes. Yeah.
No, after.
Okay.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to attend. I've been lucky to be in Beirut at this time. I know Yugoslavia fairly well. I visited all the countries in all Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Croatia, Belgrade. The only country is Slovenia. Now I have a friend I am motivated to visit. And when I go, I try to read their literature. And I find that literature really integrates old fighters. They hate each other, but they all love Androvich, the Bridge on the Drina. All of them are attached to this novel. I remember reading a novel titled Ministry of Pain, which is related to how to treat trauma. I'm sure you are familiar with this novel, Ministry of Pain by Dubrovka Orjisk. It's about a professor, I think she's Croatian originally, in Amsterdam, who decided to treat trauma by teaching old fighters Serbian literature in Amsterdam. And she discusses with them certain topics in literature. And through this discussion, she reveals the wounds and tries to reveal the wounds. And she has been successful, except I think one of them had committed suicide at the end of the novel. So Ministry of Pain was, in a way, a path to treat trauma. It was a great success, and it's a great novel. And I think this is lacking in our area. This is lacking in our area. My second point is about ISIS. I think there is a misunderstanding about ISIS. ISIS was established not by a religious group. It's by the old intelligence service of the Iraqi Mukhabarat. The spokesman for the group is a religious man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But those who established ISIS were from the intelligence service, and some of them were trained in East Germany. They were lieutenant when Saddam was removed, but later they became more senior. They chose Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as a spokesman for them when they met him. But he was not really the leader. And they were not even religious. The real leader of ISIS his name is Haji Bakr, and when he was killed, the American intelligence service, they searched his house and they did not find Quran. They did not find a copy of the Quran. And those members of the intelligence service, they were motivated by hatred to the Shia. And that is why when al-Zawahiri decided to criticize ISIS for attacking the Shia, he did not call Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He tried to reach Haji Bakr, and he failed. You find there is a big difference between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Jabhat al-Nusra never attacked the Shia. Al-Qaeda never attacked the Shia. Maybe it happened sometime. But ISIS is motivated by hatred to the Shia, and the reason for that is because these lieutenants, these army officers, they were deprived from their jobs. When the Iraqi army was dissolved, all of a sudden they were found without a job. So there were political conditions, economic conditions, which has generated Daesh. And Daesh is not really originally a religious radical group. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You need the microphone.
Okay.
We'll take like 2 questions and then we'll give
Thank you so much, Janja, really for this talk. If you like, generally speaking, I don't disagree with your analysis, but if you like, but I have some concern. Looking to now this what I call psychological turn of our society, this psychologization. I mean, let's be concrete. For instance, in the United States, become the issue for all academic freedom in the university is the Jewish trauma, is anti-Semitism. I mean, that you alienate a certain group while there is a genocide and material things is going on. So, in your conclusion, you start by saying trauma is central. I mean, how you as a social scientist and working in fuzzy model if you like, how will you combine trauma, which I agree it's important, with other factors, and how maybe the other factors become at certain point more central and less central. I think the contribution of Dr. Hamid here is to say you need to look to the other side. And maybe there is so much unjust in Syria and Iraq that your motivation to go is not really your if you like your trauma, but your call for justice. Again, it's I think I don't know if you read Olivier Roy's book Jihad and Death about it's a very important book. It's based on an interview of 35 family members whose a young went to Syria and Iraq. And it's very interesting what he showed that these people, most of them, they are well integrated. Some of them engineers, economically integrated, but socially absolutely isolated, have problem in a French society. So this is. And the other point, I think there is a report produced, I read it, I don't remember, maybe Human Rights Watch did it, about a big camp of those who went from Europe to Syria to support the Syrian people against this mighty savage regime, and suddenly they realized that no, it's a savage resistance. It's ISIS, it's Al Qaeda. So at certain point they left and they went back. And they want, so those who were escaped, they stay in this Turkish camp until there is a negotiation with their country to take them, and some of them is still there, by the way, until today. But I mean, so I think in your analysis, you need to factor in more, if you like, mundane social justice claim beyond nation state. I mean, somehow, otherwise you will fall in the trap of security, if you like, approach of those. Everyone travel to another nation state and not called by the government, they become terrorists. And by the way, in this case, for instance, you don't say one word about Hezbollah because Hezbollah is called by Syrian government. So in this security approach, it become not the terrorist. The terrorist is the other. So I think, I mean, my feeling that you need really to show us at certain point what is a place of this trauma compared to other material factors that motivate these people to go. So.
Perfect.
You want to answer and then we take, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, but if you want to answer first, go ahead.
Would you like to take one more? Would you like to...
Yeah, I can reply now,
Okay,
briefly.
so we'll give you the floor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. Can I start with
Yes.
reflections? Yes. I mean, it's really great that you mentioned the book and the initiative of educating, right? So educating, let's say, former enemies and portraying the different narratives, confirming the suffering of the other. But what I would like to show you, I hope I will find, this is, the education is one of the, on the internet, one of the main issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you know, because they don't have, they don't have just separate curricula. Oh, it's
This one, two schools.
yes.
Okay.
Where is the photo? Can I? Aha,
Oh,
I
yeah.
can see the photo.
I'll show you. Here you go.
Because the schools, all the schools in Bosnia and Herzegovina are ethnically divided. So physically, first physically, I want to show you here, it's a very famous policy called two schools under one roof system. This is the example from Travnik. So it's divided, as you can see, on two sides, right? So on the right side, you can see the Croatian high school, Catholic, and on the left, it's a Muslim one. It's a Bosniak Muslim one. And here, I think they tear it down, but there used to be a fence here, okay? The fence, so the children could not play together. I mean, this is the high school, they're a little bit bigger. So, yes, this is how the, you know, divisions and hatred are institutionalized in the school system as well. And of course, yeah, I agree with everything you said in relation to ISIS. And as I emphasized in my my presentation, all of the respondents that we have interviewed were very critical, I would say, of ISIS, betrayed also by ISIS. They were emphasizing they're not really advocating for real Islamic values. And so this was also one of the important moments of betrayal, of being traumatized when they saw all the atrocities committed by them, etc. Sari, thank you very much for emphasizing this. I also feel now when I'm writing the reports of my research that I really need to emphasize more how trauma is interlinked with other factors, like you said. Because my claim is that it's not just trauma in isolation, and that is the most or the only factor, right? And let's forget about all the other well-established radicalization models that really emphasize this interplay of, let's say, structural factors. So let's say the things we talked about, the neglect, marginalization, discrimination, poverty, etc. Then individual, right, incentives. So because many people live in this kind of conditions, but minority becomes extremist, right? So there has to be some individual incentives to go on these pathways. And what I want to do is to really present how trauma is interlinked with both the structural individuals, with the aspects of justice. I would definitely need to highlight this more because this is something that came out of interviews as well. So this need for justice, for dignity, for empowerment. I just, yes, need to present more clear that trauma is interlinked. It doesn't work in isolation, but I think the trauma perspective help us to deepen our understanding of both structural and individual incentives. Because if you say, for example, okay, people want to feel belonging, or a lot of Europeans joined because of the adventure. But why? Why they need this feeling of belonging, right? What is what happened in their life that they feel these needs? Why they don't feel safe? Why they feel injustice? And why then they become susceptible to these extreme narratives? So I think trauma deepens these kind of questions and our understanding.
Hi, I'm Ahmed. I'm a student here. Thank you so much. I would like to state at the beginning, before I continue on with my question, which is relevant, you partly answered it with the trauma, upcoming research of trauma interlinked with other factors. I just want to state at the beginning, and from my experience here at the UB as a student and overall in Lebanon and within the social studies circle, sociology in particular, that just highlighting the importance of such concepts is so critical and so important. So just thank you for that. Even the work is never done. My question is relevant to the concept itself. As a construct, probably highly influenced by Eurocentric thinking and Western thinking, right? So a few points within that question. You mentioned you used an international trauma survey, right? Just to trigger some thoughts, if you use that same survey for US citizens on the Eastern Coast after 9/11, right? You probably would find different results, or you might even find no proof of trauma, yet the reaction and the aftermath of what happened, which was yesterday's anniversary, yielded similar extremist or radicalization or Islamophobia, and there are conspiracy theories of that being a tool or all of that, especially with the global Zionist movement. So in Tripoli, for example, do you think, or in non-Western context, do you think in future research, and when you're studying the interlinkage of trauma with other social, psychological issues and concepts, do you think you need, or there is a need to adapt the concept to fit within the interlinking stuff with culture, tradition, religion, concepts of justice, what's right and wrong, what's good and what's bad? I say this because in your conclusion you also state policy recommendations or what could be done. So, and this is relevant to the field of neuroscience, maybe the methods of rehab that are applicable in Western context are not as applicable or as effective in Tripoli's context or in South Lebanon's context or in Beirut explosion context, right? So I say this because the neuroscience can show that two people that have been undergone very similar traumatic event, if they come from different backgrounds and from different cultures, their brain responds differently. They both can pass through what you call trauma, but in a different way, right? And lastly, one point, those politicians in the structural system, be it in Bosnia or in Lebanon, those politicians themselves, and if you expand trauma to childhood trauma, to all of that, just an opinion, are probably more traumatized than those extremists that so when you say that they are propagating a specific ideology to re-enliven dynamics of collective past events, they themselves are the victims of trauma as well, the politicians themselves, and I would assume they're probably more traumatized than the jihadi extremist. Thank you so much.
We have a question at the back.
Thank you.
And 3 questions. Take 3 questions, and then I will ask you my question.
Okay.
Hi, sorry I came in late, but I had a class. But based on what I have heard, just concerned, and I want to confirm what Sari was mentioning about the trauma. I don't know how you define trauma, whether it is from the psychological point of view, but this concept I would tend to think cannot be understood without a social fact background. You know, Emil Durkheim, when he talked about the integration and the regulation concept, the social facts, this would define more the understanding of a trauma. Eventually, Sari mentioned the book of Jihad and Death. I thought about the book of Yasmina Khadra, The Attack, that talks pretty much about these types of suicide slash jihad slash death that would, and eventually this physical structure that you mentioned in Durkheim, in Emil Durkheim, it's more, this division is rather a way to bond social cohesion and start for unity rather than division and eventually trauma and then radicalized identities. Just an observation. I don't have a question. It's thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this very important presentation. In Bosnia, during the war, rape was used as a weapon of war. And many women had to give their babies for adoption. Can you tell us more about what happened to the women and also to the children who became adults?
Do we have any additional questions from the audience? Tablakin, we'll do this round.
Maybe last, because it's last. We remain 10 minutes.
So I come from Syria, so I have lots of stories about that. And I think they are radicalized at a young age, where they don't really make a decision. They're just framed into it. And the lack of other options, the lack of work, the lack of education. So it doesn't have to be always, you know, that this is a result of a trauma. It's also, as Sari said, social injustice. Yeah, and we've seen a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think I'll just leave then my very quick final question. Since you mentioned it, I thought it's very interesting for us to ask. So I have an empirical question. So you did conduct fieldwork in Lebanon, but you were unable to conduct fieldwork in Bosnia. So I want maybe for you to, you know, speak a little bit about the discrepancies between having access to one field and then not having access to another, and how were you able to sort of supplement that, and what were the challenges, I guess, finally to wrap things up, that you had in accessing the field in Bosnia?
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for all the comments and questions. Yes, maybe I would start with conceptualization and the measurement of trauma that my colleague mentioned. So first is this really wrong perception, or like Sari mentioned, we talk about trauma these days on a daily basis, yes. This wrong misconception that trauma is the event, is some natural disaster, is the war, is the conflict, etc. This is the first misconception, yes, that we have. But actually, I love the definition of trauma by one of the leading scholars, Gabor Mate, who says trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you because of what happened to you. So even the word trauma has the Greek origin. It means wound, yes. So it's a wound. This is the first thing that we need to consider. Second, yes, there are many different definitions of trauma, and what I try to do is to integrate the definitions and operationalization from psychology. So in psychology, they usually differentiate between these capital T and small t trauma, right? In the capital T, there are these big, events. And the small t trauma, they talk about these minor, events that we usually do not consider as traumatic, like bullying and peer violence, attachments disrupted between the child and the parent in the childhood, etc. So I try to combine this operationalization with the sociological, definitions of trauma. They talk about the collective trauma, cultural trauma, or social trauma. But what is the issue that you were referring to are the measurements, right? So I took the ICT. I'm not a psychologist. So I studied political science and sociology, and now I'm doing the certification in traumatic stress studies. I'm not a psychologist, but after consulting with psychologists and therapists, they told me, okay, take this measure because this is the measure that is adapted to the international context, whether in US, Australia, or non-Western, or let's say South countries of the global South, etc. However, this questionnaire was just a small part of my research. I wanted something for them to fill in, to have, let's say, more quantitative, data, but I combined this data with their personal life stories, with their narratives. I think this is a must if we want to understand holistically their stories, not just to put them the questionnaire and let them fill in and we will make the assessment. No, we have to combine the quantitative and the qualitative part. And the neuroscience, I mean, this is the field that is very fascinating for me as well. It really progressed in recent years. And like you mentioned, we can have two individuals living more or less in similar context, experiencing the same event, I would say potentially traumatic events, but as I said, it's important what happens inside of us, right? Because trauma affects our brains, our bodies, it's stuck in our nervous system, it affects our belief system, it affects our behaviors. We have to look at all these four fields. And one person can respond very differently to another, so we have to look at, I know Lebanese don't like the word resilience.
True.
How resilient is an individual? Or let's say, what are the protective factors? This is not the topic in my research, but it's very interesting, maybe in the continuation as well. So this is the big question. What differentiates, in radicalization studies, what differentiates this minority of extremists to the general population? Because we have to know that we are talking about the minority of population. Most Bosniaks, they're very moderate, they're very tolerant. It's just the minority that is radicalized. Also in Lebanon, right? Or in Tripoli. So we have to look at the protective factors, and these usually include, material resources, social psychological resources, cultural resources. There are a lot of studies on family factors, how the family environment can act as a protective factor or as a risk factor, right? Or what the lady at the end mentioned, the socialization. How is the socialization? If a baby is born in camp in Syria, what are his possibilities? So this is also now one of the main questions when it comes to foreign terrorist fighters and their return to the European countries, because we have a story of former fighters, and then we have a story of hundreds and hundreds of females and children that either left to Syria or they were born there. So now how to approach this? This is a huge debate in the European Union and Europe context. So yeah, that was the rape question. Yeah, I mean, rape during the Bosnian War, this is like a big field of research actually, because according to the data, there have been, so rape was used as a weapon of war, obviously, and there are estimations that there have been around 20,000 women raped during the war. And there are, many initiatives, many programs also established by the women themselves. There's a really big empowerment happening in the field. I can give you some links and references if you're interested more, because we are running out of time. Yes, and the field work. We are still recording this. Yes.
Off the record.
I will tell you
Maybe
one part, formal part.
You can tell. No, I think you can keep the formal part since it's being
I will
recorded.
keep the formal part. So before applying this postdoctoral project proposal, the colleagues told me at the University of Sarajevo, look, most probably you will not have any issues accessing the prison. Yeah. So there's still a lot of former fighters imprisoned, and you will be able to conduct these life story interviews with them. But it takes some time for the project to be submitted, accepted. So I think it went like a year. A year went around, and I was preparing for my field research. I came to Sarajevo. I first, discussed topics with my colleagues, with professors, with researchers at some research institutes. And then we were like, okay, so now I would like to go to the second stage, conducting the interviews with former fighters. I was interested in the prison setting, as well as with those that are outside, that are released and living back in their communities. So with the prison, there were a lot of people engaged, trying to help me to get the access. So from professors, social workers who worked in the prison. But at the end, the Ministry of Justice declined my request. So the formal explanation was that these are people who are charged with terrorism, so you don't have access to the This is formal explanation, but I can tell you later on what was the real reason behind this decision. So then I said, okay, so let's try with the people who are outside. But the social worker told me that now, because of the politics, especially in Republika Srpska, so this political discourse, denial of the genocide. Last year the UN adopted a resolution on Srebrenica that also, it commemorates 11th of July as Remembrance Day, and also emphasizes that denial is prohibited. So that was a huge topic in Republika Srpska and Serbia. You know, a Serbian president made quite a show in the UN General Assembly, coming with the Serbian flag in the assembly, yes, and denying the genocide. So also because of that, these communities became very reluctant. You know, they isolated themselves even more. They're living in remote villages, and they told me even the police, Bosnian police, rarely enters these areas. So this was the.
So in any case, I can tell you that I know two PG students tried to do field work in Rumi prison was impossible. So this is again, I think security apparatus has autonomy in all authoritarian regime and sectarian regime. Thank you so much, Janja, for this amazing talk. Thank you, Rima, and hopefully to see you in our next CAMES talk will be in October 6 with the Brazilian professor, the head of director of the Palestine study at the University of São Paulo. So hopefully we'll announce the talk soon. Thank you.